Hi, welcome everybody. I'm Angela Coles. I'm the events coordinator at the Rhine Research Center. And this year we are kicking off our 90th anniversary celebration of the original Duke Parapsychology Lab. And so tonight we have a special presentation by Loyd Auerbach and John Kruth. They're going to be talking about the Rhine's legacy, some influential figures that have come through the Rhine and where they're headed, and also how they got involved with the Rhine. I'm sure they're very familiar to most of you, but for those of you who are new to the Rhine, Loyd is our board's president, but he's also been involved in paranormal research and investigations for decades. He's one of our main educators at the Rhine Research Center, and he's also the president of the Forever Family Foundation, written extensively on the field, and is also a mental magician. John Kruth is our executive director and co-founder of our education program. He's written numerous publications on scientific parapsychology and has a research interest in ultra-weak photons and aphantasia and how that relates to psi experiences. So I'm sure this is going to be a really fun and informative experience. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's good to see everyone. And Loyd, thank you for being here. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about the Rhine, being that it's been 90 years since the Duke Parapsychology Lab was opened in 1935. The Rhine has a great history, and we've come a long way since then. So we're going to try to just have a little discussion between Loyd and I about some things that we remember about the Rhine, some of the history of the organization, and some of the people that we know have been associated with the Rhine along the way. I'm going to let Loyd start off and jump in with some of his memories of the Rhine, or some of his thoughts about where the Rhine got started.
Right. Well, I'm going to set the stage a little bit for the start of the Rhine in some respects.
Great.
So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. All right. So in actuality, of course, many of you, if not all of you, know that our field got started, parapsychology got started as psychical research, which is still a name by which it's known, in the 1800s. The 19th century was an amazing time in many respects. It was the rise of rational empiricism in science, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of real good stage magic happened that time too. And of course, spiritualism got started in 1848 with the arrival and performances of the Fox sisters. Spiritualism grew out of that, and we ended up with officially calling people mediums, whether they were physical or mental mediums, or even just people calling themselves clairvoyants if they were psychic in some way. Spiritualism was very popular in the US, in North America. It spread to the continent and the United Kingdom very quickly. And then it kind of started dying off a little bit in the US, but then the Civil War happened and people lost so many loved ones that spiritualism really took another big swing. It was also, of course, the time when physical mediumship shifted quite a bit, and we started having seance rooms and a lot of phony mediums too. And things changed through the beginning of the 20th century. But in the latter part of the 1800s, people got interested, people as in scientists, also literary figures, politicians, especially starting in the United Kingdom. And that led to the founding of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, in 1882 in the United Kingdom. And 3 years later, in 1885, the start of the American Society for Psychical Research, which is sadly no longer with us these days. Maybe there'll be a reincarnation at some point down the road. We'll have to see. There was, besides investigations of mediumship and haunted houses and gifted subjects, whether they were psychics or others, there were committees in the SPR that focused specifically on apparitions and hauntings, another committee that looked at physical phenomena, from poltergeist phenomena to physical mediumship. They looked at thought transference, which of course we know by telepathy today. And they also looked at things like hypnosis and dreams, because those were still unusual phenomena or activities at that time. And there was also a literary committee kind of looking at the history. And all of those folks, or all those subject matters, with the exception perhaps of hypnosis, are still being studied within the field, although we've looked at hypnosis as an altered states induction that might help ESP and other psychic performance. In the early 20th century, seances were going strong. I mean, there wasn't a lot of other entertainment. There were, of course, silent films, but seances were a form of entertainment. There were other psychic parlor games that people were playing at the time. And this led to some really interesting blowback from a developing psychology community, which was kind of divorcing itself from psychical research, as well as from other scientists who just wanted nothing to do with spiritualism. The Scientific American magazine actually had a committee in the 1920s that looked into, like the old Amazing Randy's challenge, they had a challenge to prove or disprove the existence of psychic phenomena, whether a medium was genuine or not. One of the main proponents, most famous proponents of spiritualism in that time period was Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries and many others. And Doyle didn't start out as a spiritualist, but because of a number of tragedies in his lifetime up till that point, especially something that really kind of pushed him even further was the death of his son during World War I, in 1918. He really became not only a proponent, a believer in spiritualism, but an actual advocate. And he traveled around through North America, through UK and Europe, giving lectures about spiritualism. In that time, he also became very friendly with an opponent to spiritualism, Harry Houdini. And the two of them had a famous, I guess you could call them frenemies in some respects. Houdini wrote quite a bit in his lifetime, which ended in 1926, about his friendship with Arthur Conan Doyle, and how Doyle, who, by the way, you may or may not know, was the one who supported the Coddlingham fairies, the photos of fairies that turned out to be fraudulent. There are a couple other potential hoaxes he may have been taken in by, or there's even question about one of them, the Piltdown Man hoax as well, that he may have been involved in. But Houdini explained all of his tricks to Conan Doyle, and Conan Doyle thought he was still psychic, that he was doing everything psychically. That's what he put out. So we come to the mid-1920s, and a very famous medium by the name of Marjorie, or Minna Crandon, in Boston, was getting a lot of publicity and a lot of notice from the American Society for Psychical Research and the Scientific American Committee. Marjorie was a controversial figure. Houdini investigated her, claimed, put out a monograph, which you can find in a number of places, including the Internet Archive, explaining how she did her physical mediumship, even while locked in this box where her hands and her head were the only thing poking out. Within the magic community, I'll tell you that there are some historians that wonder if Houdini actually framed her, but that's a whole different story. Right, so Conan Doyle was a supporter of mediumship, of physical mediumship. His second wife, I believe it was actually a medium. And there was a lot of, again, head-to-head with Houdini, but they had kind of a friendly rivalry in many respects. After Houdini passed away, though, we had something happen. I'm going to turn it back over to John to talk a little bit more about Marjorie.
Thank you, Loyd. And, before we get into detail about Marjorie, Loyd said that Arthur Conan Doyle, and oh, by the way, I'm going to go back to the previous pictures. That picture of the tall guy and the short guy.
That's Houdini and Conan Doyle. Yeah, yes. We should probably.
And all the way in the corner, that is Marjorie. That's a picture of her on the bottom right-hand corner.
Right.
But what had happened was that Conan Doyle was going around the country and around Europe, talking about his experiences with the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, and the work he was doing to explore mediums and learn about mediums from a scientific perspective. Well, he happened to give a talk in Chicago, and as he was giving his talk, in the audience was a young J.B. Rhine, who was at the University of Chicago. He heard Conan Doyle speak about this and he got very excited. He immediately went home and spoke to his wife, Louisa, both of them at the University of Chicago, having just finished their PhDs in biology studying botany. This is pretty amazing. Louisa Rhine having a PhD in botany at that time, JB just finishing up, being introduced to this new concepts that Arthur Conan Doyle was talking about. And he went home and told his wife, I think I finally found a way to engage my interest in science and my interest in spirituality. And this was what brought him to start to study the topics that we study today. Well, he started to explore these topics with different people. He started to talk to different people around the country who were associated with the SPR, who were associated with what they were calling the Boston Society for Psychical Research, which eventually was also the American Society for Psychical Research, one or the other. I think it was the American Society first. And as he started to speak to people there, he engaged in conversations with a man named William McDougall. William McDougall was at Harvard and had been studying these topics of spiritualism and mediums and exploring mediums. Well, as JB started to get interested, he was introduced to this woman, Marjorie, and the fact that she was doing mediumship work. Well, he and his wife, Louisa, decided they would attend one of the mediumship sessions along with McDougall to learn more about what she was doing. His interest was to determine, is mediumship real? Are they really getting information that might be considered paranormal in a sense, in the terms we would use now? When he went to the sessions, he went with a scientific eye. And Loyd, I'm not sure your background on this, how much you know about what these sessions were like.
I know a bit about what the sessions were like. Someone I worked with at the ASPR when I was working there in the early 80s, her father, Mark Richardson, was one of the ASPR researchers who was involved. And, you know, the Marjorie mediumship caused a major split, which is why there was a Boston Society. Partly because Marjorie, you know, it was not uncommon, let me back up a minute, to say that physical mediums were often strip searched. If it was a woman, by a nurse, otherwise by a doctor at the time, to make sure they weren't secreting things on their body. Now, sometimes they were secreting things in their body. They didn't quite get to that level of strip search at this point. But Marjorie actually went a step further, and occasionally for the scientists would do her seance totally in the nude, which led to, according to Marion Nestor's father's journals, led to a lot of, let's say, interest by some of the elderly scientists who were involved, and disinterest and disgust for some of the others, which is that's a major thing that caused the split. That, and whether Marjorie was or was not a fraud, was a big contributing factor too.
And Arthur Conan Doyle was a big supporter of Marjorie. He believed that she was a legitimate medium and that she was doing really good work. Well, when JB went and did his investigation, and he explored, he was trying to explore the different phenomena and trying to determine, was it real? So he looked at the different equipment she had and different things that appeared to be supernatural in nature. And as he explored it, he saw that there seemed to be certain magic tricks that were being played. For example, he found evidence of thread that was led into an invisible thread that was led into a sealed container that could be pulled and could cause a change in what was going on in the container, and some other things that were obviously trickery. And he published an article on this. One of his, I believe it was his first article he published on mediumship related to the Marjorie investigation that he did. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle saw this and didn't like it. The two of them started to have a bit of a feud. Although JB, being a young guy, was really just trying to do his best to be scientific about things and move forward. But Conan Doyle had some things to say about this, didn't he, Loyd?
Yes, he did, because, you know, he'd already dealt with Houdini doing this to him. and other folks as well in the Scientific American Committee. So yeah,
Yes.
it was not pleasant apparently.
But nonetheless, J.B. Rhine became a scientific investigator in the same vein as what was being done at the ASPR and at the SPR in Europe at the time. At this point, having worked with McDougall, publishing a professional paper in this area, McDougall became very interested in his work and started to mentor him. Well, shortly after JB had done his work in Boston, McDougall was offered a new position to be the head of psychology at a new university in North Carolina called Duke University in Durham. He invited JB to come down to Durham and be a member of his staff at Duke University in his psychology department. He assured JB that while he was there, he could continue to study mediums and continue to do this investigations, follow this path while he was being teaching in the psychology department. This was in 1927. J.B. Rhine and his wife Loiza packed up their things and took a long road trip down to North Carolina. And as the story goes, as they drove into town, Loiza turned to J.B. and said, "You brought me to a city that doesn't even have a bookstore." Well, things have changed since then. And now JB and Loiza started to set up their home in the area here. And JB, teaching at the university, started to explore mediumship. But as he started to explore mediumship, trying to understand, can these people communicate with spirits? Are they actually able to get information? He found some of them were getting information that they probably shouldn't have gotten. But how were they getting it? Were they getting it because their uncle was whispering in the ear of the medium and telling them all the secrets? Or were they getting it from another way? He had to know what are the limits of human capability. So for example, if you go to a medium and the medium starts telling you all about your deceased loved one, your uncle who passed away a few years ago, could it be that they're getting that from you? Telepathy, mind-to-mind communication. Or perhaps they're able to, at your house, you have your uncle's library set up with his trophies on the wall and his smoking jacket and his pipe, and somehow the medium is able to see this from a distance. Clairvoyance, getting information from a distance. Or maybe in about a half hour, you're going to tell them everything there is to know about your uncle who passed away, and the medium is able to see things through time, precognition, be able to tell you what you're going to say in the future. So before JB felt comfortable saying that they were actually communicating with spirits, he had to know, is telepathy real? Is clairvoyance real? Is precognition real? And these are some of the experiments that he started to do. So in his early work in parapsychology, he used these ESP cards that you can see in the center there. And up there on the top left, you can see that's a picture of actually the original group that was working on these experiments at Duke University. It's Charlie Stewart, JB in the middle, and Gaither Pratt on the right. Well, as they started to work with these ESP cards that were created by a man named Carl Zener, many people call them Zener cards, the ESP cards were being used to test telepathy and clairvoyance and precognition. If you're not sure how that works and how to do it, I recommend you go to our YouTube channel and check it out because it goes into detail about each of them and how it's used. What JB was at Duke University on campus trying to get people to come to his lab to show whether they could do telepathy or not, do clairvoyance or not. And as he was surveying the students, this one man walked in one day named Adam Linsmeyer. And Adam said, "You know, my friends told me I should come over here because I'm really lucky. Anytime we're gambling, I always win." He said, "I'm able to guess things that are going to happen." He said, "I think I might be good at what you're doing." Well, JB started to test him with the ESP cards, and just going through the first few cards, He missed the first one. The second one he got right. The third one he got right. And he continued and he got 7 in a row correct. This is far beyond what you would expect from chance. So JB said, wait a minute, let's stop here and tell me a little bit about what you're doing. And what Adams told him is, I'm really good at this whenever I'm not paying attention to it too much. Whenever I'm able to distract myself and look at other things and kind of see other things, I'm able to get this information more easily. So they took a ride out in the car and they continued to try to guess cards, and he continued to get them correct. He got so many correct that JB said there must be something here to study. It seems like there's something we can further explore here. Over the next 4 years, working with different members of the Duke University student body and different people from the community, JB was able to definitively say that he was getting evidence that telepathy occurred, that clairvoyance occurred, and that precognition occurred, and all of these being tested using these ESP cards. Well, at that point, JB, being a university researcher and being on the staff, decided to publish a monograph. And he published a monograph called Extrasensory Perception. This publication came out in 1934, and within just a few months, it became a New York Times bestseller. It was so popular, people all over the world started to contact Duke University to ask them about this new science that's being studied called parapsychology. JB had defined the scope of the field of parapsychology by naming these 3 phenomena, telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition, as extrasensory perception. It became so popular and so many people started to contact the university that McDougall encouraged JB to form a new department within the university called the Department of Parapsychology, and they founded the Duke Parapsychology Lab in 1935. When they founded the lab, they continued to do these experiments. They started to get people from all over the world who would come and talk to them about their own experiences. People were writing letters to them. Gaither Pratt, who is there on the left, started to do experiments on other things as well. They started to look at dice and whether people could control dice with their intention. As the story goes, the lab became so popular, people were coming from all over the world, and this one man walks into the lab one day and says, hey, I'm a gambler, and I can control the roll of dice. I can actually avoid having the numbers that I want to come up. So if you want a 4 to come up, I can avoid you ever getting a 4. If you want a 7 to come up, I can avoid getting a 7. JB said, well, yeah, but we do this thing with the cards. Do you do things with cards? He said, no, but I can do it with dice. And so JB said, show me. He was curious, and he did. He was able to avoid getting the numbers that JB named. And so having this experience led him to explore whether this new phenomena, mind-matter interaction, what they were calling psychokinesis, whether this was possible. You'll hear me use the term psychokinesis, PK, interchangeably. It's all the same thing. It's mind-matter interaction. As they started to study this, they found that people did seem to be able to do this some people were able to do this on a more regular basis. But they were a little hesitant to publish anything about this in 1935 because it was already a stretch for people to believe that ESP was real and that people were communicating, because it didn't follow the strict scientific paradigm that had been in place for so many years. Well, you can see, as I said, Gaither doing some experiments with dice in an automatic dice rolling machine there. And it's a cage that tumbles and dice would fall through it, and people would try to get the numbers they wanted to come up. Over on the right, you can see that's Sally Rhine Feather, whenever she was a young woman, who was testing people with ESP cards in the lab and trying to see whether people could guess the cards that were being selected on the other side. And in the center there, that's the Journal of Parapsychology.
This is the first issue of the Journal of Parapsychology.
And that was
Volume one.
published in 1937.
Correct. March 1937 is the date.
Yes. And so when they started publishing a Journal of Parapsychology, they needed a way to disseminate all of the research they were doing, and none of the journals existed to publish work on these topics. They were publishing in psychology journals, but they really needed their own place to publish it. So initially, the Journal of Parapsychology was more like reports from the lab at Duke University. As they continued, it became more and more labs started to pop up in different parts of the country and different parts of the world. And each of these labs, many of them using the ESP cards that were invented at the Duke Lab, started to get either positive or negative results. At first, JB was convinced that you could, if you had a researcher who knew how to work with the cards, who knew how to work with the research participants, that they would get results demonstrating ESP was occurring. So initially, the Journal of Parapsychology only published results that supported the field of parapsychology and supported ESP. Over a period of time, JB was convinced that no, you're going to get researchers who won't get it, but we need to publish everything. The Journal of Parapsychology at that point did start publishing articles that did not support the ESP hypothesis. Still to this day, we publish the Journal of Parapsychology at the Rhine, and we publish reports that support parapsychological topics, but also those that do not. Very few journals these days will publish articles that do not have positive results. They'll figure it was a failed research experiment. In the Journal of Parapsychology, we see this as an opportunity to learn more about the topics we're studying, so we continue to publish those. This work went on starting in 1935 for a number of years at Duke University. In the middle of this, though, remember, this all started out when JB and Loiza were back at the University of Chicago. Loiza is at home. She's raising the kids and taking care of everything. Her husband is getting extremely popular and extremely famous in the field of parapsychology. Loiza, having a PhD herself, wanted to participate, wanted to help, wanted to be part of the process. And so she was asking JB, what can I do? I have to be home with the kids, but is there something I can do from here? JB had many, many letters that had come from people around the country. So many that he didn't have the staff and he could not personally respond to all of them. He asked Loiza if she would take these letters and start to respond to the different people who were writing the letters in. Well, Loiza, in her kitchen, between naps or between meals with the kids, she would start reading the letters and writing responses to people. But she noticed, as she started reading these letters, which were at that time coming in by the hundreds, she noticed that there were some patterns in what she was reading, that she seemed to see similar types of experiences from different people from different parts of the world. This intrigued her a great deal, and she started to explore this topic as a botanist, as a biologist. She started to classify the different events that she was seeing. She started to give them coding to say this one happened when someone was awake. This one happened when someone was dreaming. This one happened intentionally. They were trying to get information. This one happened spontaneously out of the blue. As she started to explore this, she developed techniques. This was revolutionary, not just in parapsychology, revolutionary in science, that she started to develop techniques to gain information from spontaneous data and utilize what we now call qualitative analysis methods in order to understand what was being told to her, whether these events were true or not. She was exploring them as if they were experiences that people were having. She did some amazing work, published a number of books, and continued to write for many years following this. If you don't know about Loiza Rhine, I definitely recommend you explore some of her work. and look at some of the books that she's written, because she's written a great deal. And as I said, she did some revolutionary work in the field of parapsychology while her husband's over at Duke and everyone's coming to his laboratories.
And I want to comment about a couple things here. First, JB was doing radio interviews. The term ESP was being touted all over the place. And in fact, that's when the media and the general public started talking about ESP as the sixth sense, even though it's not really a sense at all. It's perception. But he was incredibly famous with American media, with the press. All sorts of folks were quoting him because this topic was so hot, to a point where I think it was 1955, the American College of Mathematicians actually looked at the data from ESP cards and just the data from the lab, and declared that ESP was real based on their statistical analysis of all the data. So we won't see that happen today, unfortunately.
Yeah, and to complement what you're saying, the biologists back in the 1920s were at the forefront in statistical analysis. Mm-hmm. They were doing advanced statistics and using statistics to understand the nature of different things that they were finding in the wild. So this gave JB an advantage whenever they started studying parapsychology. It gave him the opportunity to be able to explore the newest ideas within the field of chance and probability related to the ESP cards. So he designed some very advanced experiments for that time.
Yeah, and I'll also mention that the work of Loyd Auerbach was incredibly impactful for me because it's not happening in the laboratory. I mean, she's looking at people's real life experiences and looking at patterns, which is something we really should be doing today with everything we're getting with artificial intelligence. She was like a one-woman AI and search engine at that time.
Right, because she just poured through these letters, which turned out to be 20,000 letters and reports that she had over her lifetime that she had collected. And we're still collecting these today, but we'll get to that a little later.
Yeah.
So Loyd, besides Loiza and JB and some of the people we talked about a little earlier, there were some other people that were at the lab as well.
Yeah.
And I think you're familiar with some of these people.
Yeah, but I'll let you talk about Gaither Pratt first, and I'll talk about Rhea and
so. Okay, Gaither Pratt was someone who he's in the center in the back row here. All the people, I don't know all the people in this picture, but I know Gaither is in the back in the front row, in the back row, in the center. Gaither was one of the people who founded the lab with J.B. Rhine. He was one of the ones who started doing the original ESP experiments. He was one of the ones who helped to do some of the distance clairvoyant experiments. The Pratt-Pierce experiments to determine whether ESP was affected by distance. Gaither Pratt was the one who designed that study and set it up and executed it. He was instrumental in a lot of the work that was being done at Duke through the entire time that JB was there, for the full 30 years that JB was at Duke. He did some work in the 1950s looking at animals, trying to see, they were working with the military to see if they could influence animals with ESP in some way, specifically working with pigeons. And he had published some work related to whether they could use pigeons. The idea came out later was that they were going to try to use pigeons to carry explosive devices into specific areas. They were looking at homing pigeons, which seemed to operate outside of any sort of physical, anything we could tell that how they worked. They were trying to see if they might be operating via ESP. He did a number of different research projects within the field, but one of the things he's most remembered for is some work he did with William Roll.
Yeah, and actually, I don't think he gets enough credit for the model we use for poltergeist phenomena today, the recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis model, the RSPK model. That came out of a 1958 case on Long Island, the Seaford poltergeist, often known as the Popper poltergeist. And it was Roll and Pratt who were involved in that particular case, which had already been investigated by police and fire department, and even a couple of magicians were involved. People from the ASPR were involved in that. Pratt and Roll came out of that case determining that it was the young boy. He was the poltergeist agent. And I don't know how much Nandor Fodor's work previously, who would suggest at first that it's living people's unconscious impulses, how much that shaped what they came up with. But Roll has been credited with the whole model of the poltergeist when in fact Pratt was involved in the process as well. Not sure exactly to what extent, but that's a very important piece of our history, especially when we're doing investigations. We need to know more about, that's what we're looking at with poltergeist cases, typically.
And William Roll is in this picture also in the center, in the front row.
Right. So jumping down to Bill Roll, he was very interested in survival and very interested in the phenomena of PK. He was interested in spontaneous cases and did various investigations. I mean, the Seaford poltergeist is one of the most famous, but he was doing work in this area before that. He also founded the Psychical Research Foundation in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And over time, really looked at different models of psychokinesis, especially around poltergeist phenomena, some of which actually spilled over to his assessment of what apparitions actually might be. And I got the impression towards the end of his life, he had a different model that didn't involve survival of bodily death. Bill was actually one of my instructors at JFK University. He was brought in by John Palmer at that point. And in 1972, he published a book which has been reprinted, by the way, so I do encourage you to read it, called The Poltergeist. So it's kind of like the handbook of our model of the poltergeist. Pratt is in there, but to me, Pratt's kind of the unsung hero in some of this particular work as well. And then just a few things about Rhea White. So I knew Rhea starting in 1982 when I started working at the American Society for Psychical Research. Rhea was a librarian by trade who was amazingly good at doing research, and not talking about specific laboratory research, but research on the subject in literature, in other research ends of things. And if you find any of her books, I mean, she had some really interesting books. They're deep dive resources on where you can find information about the field, about the phenomena from every corner of the world. She also started, I can't call it a journal, but a publication looking at exceptional human experiences, EHEs, which are still continuing today, and bringing in other kinds of experiences that perhaps parapsychologists wouldn't look at. In the 1970s, I think it wasn't, I don't remember the exact date it was published, she and Michael Murphy, who founded Esalen Institute, because of both of their interests in golf, published a book called The Psychic Side of Sports, which for anybody who has any interest in sports at all, any sport at all, it's a great book, which has been reprinted, rewritten by the two of them as a book called In the Zone, looking at, among other things, athletes out kind of disaffected, dissociative state when they get into the zone and really weird things happen. That's a really excellent book to look at. She also became the editor of the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, which is another very important publication. The ASPR journal was published starting in the 1880s. Shortly after the SPR's publication got started, the journal, which is still going strong, and it was published technically, I think, till about 2004 was the last issue of the Journal of the ASPR at that point. But until Rhea's death, she passed away before the journal itself collapsed. But she was instrumental in getting that journal out and really getting some different kinds of publications, some papers in the publication that you would find in the Journal of Parapsychology. There are some definite laboratory research publications on the Gonsfeld work that some folks were doing, but there's also research at the ASPR and out-of-body experiences, publication of papers on investigations show up there, and some theoretical kind of musings of people like Ian Stevenson and Bill Roll and Carlos Osis and Rex Stanford and others that kind of showed up in that journal.
The journal also published a number of things related to remote viewing. Before
Yes.
remote viewing had really hit the public, it was known to the public in any way.
Yeah.
And things from Blue Harare, who was involved with some of the remote viewing experiments early on.
Stephen Schwartz also published in the journal, the ASPR. Yeah, that was one of the places where you would find articles and papers on remote viewing. And this was before Stargate was exposed to the world. A lot of folks think that Stargate was it, but actually starting in the 1970s, folks like Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff, who were doing this secret project, were still doing more public remote viewing experiments, and were also publishing material about the remote viewing experiments they were doing, but they had to limit it to the ones where the targets were not classified, basically, in that instance.
And so that's Rhea White in the bottom right-hand corner there. So those are just a couple of the people who were at the Duke Lab. There were so many others. We just really don't have time to go into all of them, but we thought we'd give you a taste of what was going on at the lab during this entire time that JB was there. So it started in 1935, the Duke Parapsychology Lab, which is why we're celebrating the 90th anniversary now. But as 1965 started to approach, J.B. Rhine was considering what was going to happen when he had to retire from Duke. At that time, professors had a mandatory retirement at the age of 70. And J.B. Rhine was approaching 70 and was going to turn 70 in 1965. As he was at Duke and getting into, it was the late 50s, he knew that parapsychology was starting to pick up around the world, and that all of these researchers that were in these laboratories were all coming to him at Duke University. They were all publishing in the Journal of Parapsychology, but he saw the future. He saw a need for a professional organization for parapsychologists, a place where they could meet together, where they could have conferences, and in 1958 founded the Parapsychological Association to provide this group, or this center, where different groups could meet together. At that point, they were running the Parapsychological Association out of the Duke Labs, and they had the first conference in Durham where people came from all over the world. But JB recognized that he could not be the face of parapsychology forever and stepped back and allowed that organization to continue independent of him. He was still greatly involved, of course, because he is considered to have defined the field early on in the laboratory. But he saw it was time to retire. He also recognized that at Duke, the emphasis on psychology was changing to biological biology. They were looking at Skinner and the idea of biological basis for behaviors. And instead of fighting with the people at Duke and saying, what I'm studying doesn't really fit with a biological basis for behavior. It's not all physical. It seems like there's something else. He recognized leaving the lab with Duke after he retired would cause the psychology department to dismantle the lab. There was no strong leader at Duke that could carry the lab on. So at that point, he had found funding, brought it to Duke to support his lab, and the university, in a very generous move, they supported JB moving off campus and creating an independent foundation called the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. We'll use the term FERNM. FERNM, Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. The idea was that this would involve consciousness and the nature of man. And a portion of this would be the Institute for Parapsychology, which was essentially taking all the work from the lab at Duke University and moving it off campus into this new foundation, this nonprofit independent foundation. JB saw this as a wonderful opportunity because he was able to do his work without being limited by all of the different, everything that the university required for research. He was able to do it independently and follow his own path where the data led him. He didn't have to deal with the politics of the university anymore. He also because Duke was supporting this move. They provided initial funding for the laboratory of nearly $1 million to give the foundation a start independently. Now, that $1 million was not coming from the university's pocket because JB had brought it in to the university, but they had no requirement to provide it, but they supported his work and wanted him to continue. He had done so much for the university in the time he was there, brought them so much attention, and had helped them to build the university to the point that it was became worldwide known, that they said, we will support the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. He was right across the street from the university. In Durham, it was right across the street. And people would continue from the university. Students would continue to go to the lab and participate in research and be part of the research as they were starting to build. The foundation and the research that was being done in the Institute for Parapsychology built on what was previously done. And JB's famous for saying, somebody asked him at one point, is ESP real? And he's famous for saying, it happens. We see it in the laboratory all the time. ESP happens. What they were doing in the Foundation and Institute for Parapsychology is trying to determine how it happens. This is where we move from proof-oriented research into process-oriented research. Some of the research that was being done at the Institute for Parapsychology included research into altered states technology, into the idea of the signal-to-noise ratio, and trying to understand, is ESP, can it be done with symbols that no one is familiar with, or does it relate to your natural language? They were doing, and also working with animals, trying to see if they could do research with animals and whether animals could express ESP or be influenced by ESP. All of this work being done at the lab started in 1965. There were so many people who worked with them at the lab for so many years. We're just going to touch again on just a few of them today. But these are some of the people, and I'll start out by mentioning in the bottom left-hand corner, that's Sally Rhine Feather. Sally is JB and Louisa's Rhine's daughter. I don't know if Sally is with us here tonight. Let me check real quick. But Sally does come by the Rhine quite often. She still participates in our research studies or research sessions. And yes, Sally is with us here tonight. And she also has been active in the lab, had been active in the lab at Fernham for a number of years. She helped with the research, did some animal research of her own, and has continued to be part of the Rhine. We'll get back to Sally in a little while. There's some other people here, and Loyd, I know you're familiar with John Palmer.
Yeah, so when I started my graduate studies at John F. Kennedy University, John was the chairman of the department of the graduate parapsychology program. He had shaped the program, pretty much created it, and was a primary instructor of some of the research classes and also one of the spontaneous case investigations classes as well. To John's credit, he didn't take all the classes himself. I think it would have been a little much anyway, but he brought in people such as the one just to the right of his picture. Robert Morse gave a class on theories and models. Bill Roll came in and did a class on spontaneous case investigations, as well as other topics. John brought in people whose names would be familiar to anyone who's read anything about the field from the 1970s to date. Scott Rogo was one of our instructors. Jeffrey Mishlove was one of our instructors. Charles Tart came in and presented to us. So did Stan Krippner and a number of other folks. So to John's credit, he really created this scientific program. It was the only science program at John F. Kennedy University, by the way. So we were the only graduates with a Master of Science as opposed to a Master of Arts degree. And of course, he has a long history with the Rhine as well. But this is for a few years. He was running the program, I think, from about 77 till mid 1983. I was one of the last people who he signed off on, whose thesis he signed off on in that summer, 1980, no, excuse me, 1981, not 83 at that point.
And John also ran the summer study program at the Rhine for quite a number of years. Probably for over 20 years, he was running the summer study program, which was taking some of the same topics and bringing in some of the same people to Durham every year and having a 2-month program where people would come and learn about parapsychology from professionals in the field. It was unique. There was nowhere else to do this that I know of in the world at that time. And it was John who designed it and who brought people together to do this. Many of our current parapsychologists in the field came to the summer study program or were at JFK University,
right,
and learned about these topics from John. And Bob Morris, who you mentioned earlier, he was also an educator, wasn't he, Loyd?
Yeah, he was a researcher and educator. He eventually, and I'll go back in a moment, but he eventually ended up being appointed to the chair of the Kessler Unit of Parapsychology in the Department of Psychology at University of Edinburgh until his untimely death due to an accident. Bob was someone who did research on animal psi. He did research, for example, he did a research study with Blue Harari, who you mentioned, Keith Harari, which involved whether or not Keith's cats could detect his out-of-body presence. Kind of a fun experiment that was done. He did quite a bit of work on human-machine interaction. He had some grants to do that, which apparently came as a result of something that happened at NORAD with a ship that went out because of the mood of the operator. That's what they determined, which caused us to almost think that we were getting missiles shot at us from Russia at the time. Fortunately, we have an early warning system that showed that wasn't happening. But Bob did a lot of work on human-machine interaction, and some of his work was really fascinating because he would go out and talk to people or bring in people who explained that they had either positive effect on technology or a true negative effect on technology. And he did a lot of work finding malfunction-linked people, especially at the beginning of the desktop computer era. There was a lot to do with that. Kind of shaped a lot of stuff that I ended up doing later on. He was heavily involved in looking at theories and models of psi. And the one thing I really loved about Bob was his very, very, very dry sense of humor. I will give you a very quick personal anecdote. After our weekend, our 1-unit session with Bob on theories and models, we as students had to come up with a paper taking a deep look at one of the theories or models of how psi works. So I did, but then I also wrote a 2-page paper on extreme low frequency waves, which is what an electromagnetic wave, but I called them ELF waves, and it was a little fantasy paper about how ESP works with ELF waves. Little elves waving on your shoulder. And when I got the paper back, there were almost no comments at all on my actual paper, but he gave me an A on the ELF wave thing with a few comments, with the last comment saying, I didn't get a chance to read the rest of the paper, but this part was really good. So just typically his sense of humor for that. Again, he was chosen to run the Kessler Unit. So he's actually responsible for a large number of parapsychologists out there with PhDs that came through the Kessler Unit over the years, which is still operating.
Yes, and they were studying anomalistic psychology as well, how they call it now,
Right.
where they study now less about, in order to maintain their academic standing within the universities. Parapsychology was starting to get, it was starting to get a bad name among different portions of academia.
Well,
But
and that's thanks to the rise of the organized skeptics. If
yes,
nothing else, yeah, in the 70s.
and because of this, they were trying to find ways that they could continue to have PhD students and have students who were interested in these topics stay within academia. And Bob Morris was one of the ones who introduced the concept of anomalistic psychology. Whether these events are true or not, they are experiences that people have, and we are able to explore these experiences the way Louisa Rhine did so many decades before.
Right.
That is still one of the models that they use in the UK in order to maintain their academic standing within the field of psychology. So John
You
Palmer
would
was an
think about Jim?
educator. Bob Morris was an educator. And in the bottom, in the center there, is Jim Carpenter. Jim Carpenter was associated with the lab back in the 1960s. He was at the Duke Parapsychology Lab. He continued to be associated with the lab as they moved off campus, and they were at Fernham, the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man. But this entire time, Jim was at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Jim was in the psychology department and publishing within parapsychology journals while he was teaching in the psychology department. Jim is a psychologist. He does counseling, and he's an excellent counselor. He still is very active. He continues to work with people within the field to help them, to help to develop their experiments and doing reviews on different research they might be doing. Jim was working within the University of North Carolina teaching concepts of parapsychology for decades. So those three that we've just mentioned, all of them were educators. All of them came to the Rhine Lab at his independent lab that he created and did research there. Jim participated in a number of research projects with the Rhine. He eventually became the president of the Parapsychological Association, and he wrote one of the most extensive theories of parapsychology that's been written. He wrote a book called First Sight, which discusses the unconscious nature of ESP and how that unconscious nature is present in everyone, just like our other senses, and that these sensory signals we get that are unconscious come to us through ESP. But not only does it come to us, but we are actively actually searching for this information at all times to help us to make decisions and help us to make to determine what's going to happen in our life. Well, Jim published this. I can't remember when he published his book. I think it was 2012. He published
Yeah,
First.
it sounds about right. Yeah.
I know the articles were published in earlier, about 2005 and 2006 in the Journal of Parapsychology. And I mention this because you can find a lot of these articles on the Parapsychology Press website where the Journal of Parapsychology is listed. You can get a lot of this information from there. But Jim has been very central to the field of parapsychology for quite a number of years. In addition, we have just above Jim, over to the other side, we have Ramakrishna Rao. Ramakrishna Rao initially he was from India, and he initially came to the United States because J.B. Rhine invited him to come and study at the Duke Parapsychology Lab with him. He worked with J.B. at the lab for a number of years, and after just a couple years, he was targeted to go back to India. He brought over other researchers as well, including a woman named Kantamani, who did research at the Institute for Parapsychology for a number of decades. Rao did some amazing work at the lab and brought it back to India and started his own foundation in India. And at Andhra University over in India, began to establish a parapsychology program, and it started to grow. It grew to such an extent that it was being supported by the Indian government. He was establishing connections within the Indian government to continue to support the field of parapsychology and parapsychology research. It's still in action in India at this current time. But what happened was, after Rao was in Durham, North Carolina, at the Institute for Parapsychology, went back to India, he would come back and visit occasionally. But in the late 1970s, mid to late 1970s, JB was looking for someone to run the Institute, to take over as director. He knew he was aging and needed to find someone else to run the Institute for Parapsychology. And he called his his friend who he knew from India, and had Rao come back and said, take this temporarily until we can find a permanent director for the Rhine. Well, that temporary assignment ended up being 18 years that Rao was at the Institute for Parapsychology and continued to direct the activities. He was back and forth between India and Durham throughout the whole time. He was continuing to raise money and maintain the business of the foundation, while he was also continuing to teach and do research on his own. So Ramakrishna Rao had a great influence on what happened with the Rhine for quite a number of years. He was the longest director, I think, besides JB, ever to hold that position within the Rhine. Loyd, did you know Ram?
Well, that goes to my personal connection here to the field in some respect. I was in when I was a student at Northwestern, I noticed a flyer on a billboard that Mundelein College, which was in Chicago, so we were in Evanston, it was like right there, was doing a 6-week mini course on parapsychology in the evenings, and it was being run by John Bisaha and Brenda Dunn. Brenda eventually went on to work with Robert John at Princeton, and so I took the course. And they had Ramakrishna Rao speaking one night about the field and about the Institute for Parapsychology. I had not ever been able to go to the summer study program, partly because of economics, but I did ask him afterwards, where can I study parapsychology? I'm almost done with college. I want to go to grad school. Where should I apply? And he said, you're in luck. A new parapsychology program just started at John F. Kennedy University. You need to look into that. Here's some information about it. So he really is the one who turned me on to this graduate parapsychology program, which was the only one in the United States at the time.
Mm-hmm. And when was that, Loyd? Was that in the
That would have been 1977.
1977? Yes.
Yeah, or maybe early 77, or I can't recall whether it was fall. I think it was like first half of 1977. Yeah.
Great. And I think there's some other people on this screen that you know.
Yeah, so that lower right-hand corner, that's Nancy Zingroni and Chuck Honorton, Charles Honorton. Now, let me talk about Nancy first. Coincidentally, Nancy and I were talking a few years ago, and it turns out she apparently was in the same mini course I was. Just didn't know each other that well. I mean, I didn't really connect with too many of the other folks who were in that it was a large group in that mini course that Bisaha taught. Anyway, I got to know Nan very well over the years, especially after she connected with and got married to my fellow JFK University graduate Carlos Alvarado. So I knew Carlos. Carlos and I were in grad school together. So Nan has been kind of part of my life for quite a long time. She has done research. She's also definitely been heavily involved. She and Carlos both were heavily involved in online education. They started a massive open online course called the ParaMOOC, which is run typically every March or April. It's a free thing get lots of guest speakers. We did it. It was last year. I mean, it should be again coming up this year, I think. I'm not sure if she's doing it this year or not. But she's been really about getting the word out, educating parapsychology, to the point where she and I worked together at Atlantic University. She was actually appointed there to start a parapsychology program, a graduate parapsychology program. This is back around, I'm not sure when she started there, it was 2008 or 2009. I knew about this in 2010. Was helping to work on this program that we were pitching to the Distance Education Committee, so the accrediting body, because it needed to be an accredited program as well. And I want to step back for a second and say that the Western Association of Schools and Colleges here that covers the Western states of the United States, and all the major universities had accredited the John F. Kennedy University program. Okay. So we were expecting that the DEAC would actually approve our program. Turned out that there was too much controversy for the program for them to deal with. And Nan spent a lot of time working on this proposal, and then finds out that they wanted a petition first, to petition them to propose the program. And it was very close scientifically to the JFK program in many respects. So John Palmer's fingerprints were also on it without him knowing it. We actually got turned down, even though Nan was able to secure letters from Nobel Prize winners in support of us having this program. Shows you the academic negativity, the bias that's out there. They basically said it's too controversial for them to touch at the time. So she left the university. She and Carlos continued to set up these massive online courses, which she runs every year. And unfortunately, Carlos passed away a couple of years ago, but Nan is still out there doing her thing with us. Chuck Honorton, and you can talk a little bit about Chuck's connection to the Rhine. I can talk more about his post-Rhine connection, post-Institute connection there.
Well, from what I understand, Chuck Honorton, when he was a teenager, was interested in parapsychology and heard about the labs in Durham and contacted JB Rhine and said, "I want to come and I want to work with you at the Rhine." While JB speaking to him, said, it's really not something you're going to be able to do as a teenager. First, you need to graduate high school before we can have you do anything with us here. And so Chuck took him at his word. He went back and finished high school and immediately came down to the lab and said, "I want to work here now," and started to do research with him at the lab in Durham at that time. He did a number of things at the lab, worked for a number of years trying to help out with different studies, and eventually in 1970 broke away from the Rhine and left and started to go his own way. JB at that point was really trying to follow a certain path with the field of parapsychology, and a number of the researchers wanted to explore new areas. And so he encouraged them to find their own ways. And at that point, I think, is when Chuck went to the Maimonides lab, Loyd. Is that correct?
Right. So Chuck worked at the Maimonides Medical Center lab on the dream telepathy studies that were done by Montague Ullman and Stanley Krippner, which probably influenced heavily his development of the Otto Gansfeld down the road. He started the Psychophysical Research Laboratories in Princeton, New Jersey, and set up a totally automated Gansfeld study that he even had. This was an odd thing. He even had brought in the amazing Randy to look over the experiment to make sure that it was okay. Not that Randy would have ever been honest about anything he found at that time. I was brought in. Actually, I had some other folks came in as well to look it over from a magician's perspective. I mean, somebody could have broken into the lab and reprogrammed the computers, but that was about the only thing you could do to screw up the experiment at that point. So he was well known for the Gansfeld studies. He actually got really positive results in the Gansfeld studies from participants there. So, established kind of the benchmark for doing Gansfeld, but also getting positive results, and participated in the kind of debate around the Gansfeld with Ray Hyman and other skeptics. He was not shying away from that either. I will say personally that Chuck heavily encouraged me to, because I was just starting to do a little bit of magic as kind of a side thing, having learned a little bit of magic in grad school, psychic fraud. He heavily pushed me further into that direction, saying that our field needed somebody who not only knew stuff, but actually could perform it as well. So big influence on me in many respects.
So these are just a few of the people, but there's a couple more that we wanted to talk about. I didn't have pictures for everyone, but these are a few people that were also at the lab. Richard Broughton was one of the researchers at the lab for quite a few years and did a lot of, at the Institute for Parapsychology, published a lot of papers, and eventually became the director of the Rhine Research Center for a couple of years in the early 90s. And he's now over in UK, and he's been working to foster new PhD candidates in the field of psychology who are interested in the field of parapsychology. And he wrote some really nice, not only papers, but he wrote a really nice book on the field of parapsychology. Loyd, you were mentioning that to me
Yeah,
the other day.
yeah. Book published in the early 90s called Parapsychology, the Controversial Science for the general public. And it is, to this day, still one of the best introductory texts, or introductory books about our field, because he wrote it in a way that the average person could actually understand instead of an academic paper. Richard was absolutely a great communicator when it came right down to it in that way.
Hmm. Yes, and besides him, there are a couple other people here. One of them is Erlander Harrelson, who
Who's there on
who
the
I knew
right side?
I know you worked with him a bit, didn't you, Loyd?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Erlander came to the was good friends with Carlos Osis, the research director at the ASPR when I was there. I got to know him fairly well when he came to visit a number of times. He was very much interested in spontaneous case, um, people having experience of all sorts. Heavily interested in out of body experiences, but really more interested in survival of bodily death. So he's written a couple of books that are available in print now, although he's passed away. He was one of the investigators that Ian Stevenson counted on to do research on children who remember previous lives, to kind of go out there into the world and do those. He was from the University of Iceland. So that university also, while it didn't have a program, had someone there who was influencing people in the area. Of course, Iceland has a fairly small population compared to the rest of the world. But absolutely very interested in all work in parapsychology, and had some connection, did have some work at the Rhine at Fernham as well. And then there's you want to comment on that, or do you want me to move on?
No,
We
no,
can move.
no. I know Ed Kelly he was at Farnham for a bit, and more recently he's been at the Division of Perceptual Studies up at University of Virginia. But I think you've done some work with him also.
Yeah, I mean, I got to know him again because for whatever reason he was often at the ASPR. Came to a number of our meetings when I was there, and as I recall, he's got an engineering background. That was kind of his previous background, and he was really a excellent researcher, but again interested in survival, which is why he's at DOPS right now,
Mhm.
working there.
Well, he just recently retired from
Yeah,
DOPS,
that's right. Forgot about that.
actually.
Yes, he did.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he was there for quite a number of years. So these are just some of the people that we could fit into our talk tonight, who were at the lab. There were so many others that we could have mentioned, and that we probably should have mentioned, but these are the ones that we were able to pull together tonight. And the Foundation for Research on the Nature of Man was founded in 1965. That's when they moved off campus and moved into the new laboratories. It was just off Duke University. In 2000, and a number of years later, they were looking at the organization and trying to determine where it was going to go in the future. And in 1995, the organization was renamed the Rhine Research Center, and there was some changes that had occurred at that time, one of them being changes in leadership. In 1995, Sally Rhine Feather, who again there is on the left, who I mentioned a few minutes ago, Sally took over as executive director of the Rhine at that time, and she was leading the organization because, well, she is the person who has been in the field longer than anybody, almost her entire life. Well, no, her entire life. She has been in the field of
He was
parapsychology.
born into it.
Yes, from the time that whenever she was a child and her father was going to the lab, her mom was reading the letters at home. She ended up studying psychology and going into a counseling career. She left the field for a while, but then every time they think they're out, they get dragged back in, right? She came back and she was at the Rhine for a number of years, and she took over as executive director to lead the organization. And she did that for quite a number of years, looking for other people to help out. One of the people she found was Stephen Schwartz, who was the executive director just for about 6 months, I think, at the Rhine. But he did have an influence because he had a vision at that time. It was a little early because it was around the year 2000, 2001, but his vision was to have a more online presence for the Rhine, developing a website for the Rhine, trying to develop ways that we could have more global events and bring people in from different areas. His vision was very strong, but unfortunately, the technology was not quite up to it at that point in time. But he did have an influence on things. At that point, Sally took over again after Stephen left, and she led the organization for for a number of years again. In the meantime, Christine Simmons Moore, who is in the kind of center there, Christine came, and she came for a couple years to do an internship at the Rhine, and she was sponsored by one of our donors to stay at the Rhine and do research here, establish herself within a career. She had a PhD in the UK. She enjoyed her time at the Rhine. She had come to the summer study program a number of years before that was sponsored by John Palmer. And like a number of people, met someone and fell in love and got married to this person that she met at the summer study program. So coming to Durham was really a dream for her, to be able to be here with her new husband and for them to be able to start a family together. Christine has since moved on. She's now at the University of West Georgia, and she's teaching psychology. In the psychology department, she's teaching parapsychology courses. She's running a parapsychology lab at a university in West Georgia. It's a wonderful opportunity. She started at the Rhine back in the around 2009, 2010. And there's this other guys there who took over as the executive director around, no, well, about 2011 or so. So he's been around for a while, and we've had some changes to the organization since that time. We've done a number of things. And Loyd, I thought at this point might be a good time for us to start talking a little bit about, hey, how did you get interested in the Rhine?
Okay, well, so going back to when I was preteen, actually before that, I was very much influenced. My interest in psychic phenomena was influenced by television and comic books in the 60s. And I had read the word parapsychology in a Superman comic, actually, before I actually heard it spoken by anybody. And I heard it spoken on the TV show Dark Shadows in the 1960s. Now, I'd already seen a lot of psychic things in Star Trek, the original series. I was a fan of Dark Shadows, the vampire, werewolf, parallel universe stuff that they were doing. And it got me interested. I was already interested in folklore and mythology, so I was occasionally reading books on vampires and werewolves and the folklore around that. Went to the library. And in many libraries, if it's a Dewey Decimal System, it's in the 133s. That's where parapsychology is. That's also where books on witchcraft and astrology and vampires and a lot of UFO stuff is. So looking for books on folklore for vampires and werewolves, I see there are these books on parapsychology. I just heard that word. And I was very much interested in science. I was heavily interested in astronomy and geology at the time. So I'm looking through these books, and I realize these are science books. These are not folklore books. And they were by J.B. Rhine, wrote some of them, J.G. Pratt, Gertrude Schmeidler. So a number of folks whose names are kind of luminaries in our field. So as a 12 and 13-year-old, I started reading those books. My high school was a senior high school. So from 7th grade on, and when I think it was about 9th grade, I got to know, we had an earth science teacher who found out about my interest in the subject, and actually a physics teacher who was heavily influenced me down the road. He was originally from India. And I came up with the idea with some of my friends, let's start a parapsychology club in high school. This is in Elmsford, New York. I tried to figure out how I could do this. So first thing I did was to write to J.B. Rhine and say, I need letters of support to try to convince the principal that I can actually do this. We can have this club.
Loyd,
so,
can I interrupt you a
yeah.
second? Because You say you wanted to start a parapsychology club. What were you imagining that was?
We were going to do experiments, ESP experiments,
Wow,
MPK
cool.
experiments. We were not doing ghost stuff. That was not what was going on. We had access. There was actually sort of a computer lab in our high school. Um, if you know, this goes back a long way. You had a teletype, which and a printout. You didn't have a monitor, and we'd have to dial up to the county educational computer. But we could actually, I learned to do some very basic programming. We could program our own, games and things like that. So that's what we were envisioning, doing that. And maybe getting out and talking to some parapsychologists in the New York area, which did come up later on. The two teachers I mentioned were interested also in supporting it. So I get this letter back from, JB Rhine. I had already written once to him asking what I can do. How can I get into the field of parapsychology educationally? Where can I study? And got a really nice letter back. It's probably our standard that still goes today, which is not a lot of places you can get a degree in parapsychology, so study something else and move into the field. But I got a great letter of support, which was given to sent to the principal. And then I had a meeting with the principal of our school, and he said, I don't know anything about this stuff, but this is an impressive letter, so we're going to let you go ahead and do it with the two teachers who are supporting you. So we ended up doing like some ESP games on the computer. We were starting to reach out, and turned out that one of my neighbors was a yoga teacher. One of my brother's best friend's mothers down the street from me pulled me over as I was walking by our house and said, "Hey, one of my students is this guy Montague Ullman, who did the dream telepathy studies. Do you want to meet him?" He lived about a mile and a half from me, and we had Monty Ullman lecture to us, to our parapsychology club. And then I got to meet Gertrude Schmeidler, who lived like 2 miles further down the road. And we were able to make connections because of this club all over. And it was all because of this really good support letter from JB Rhine that we had.
And that led you to continue to study these things on your own?
That totally led me, totally felt supported in studying parapsychology in high school. Again, the two teachers, especially Shahid Ashraf, who was the physics teacher from India, who had no skepticism. He had his own experiences, including an apparitional experience, which was pretty interesting. I ended up eventually going to Northwestern University, studying astronomy the first year, and then switched because of the math. But I studied under J. Allen Hynek and the UFO guy, and even volunteered at the Center for UFO Studies and had talks with him about psychic phenomena because he was well versed in parapsychology, as it happens. I switched myself along with a couple other students into anthropology. When I was assigned, and this is a kind of a bizarre thing, the universe had some plan for me, I guess, but I got assigned to this professor, Chris Bohm, and as my advisor in anthropology. I was told to wait in his office. He was out in the restroom. I waited, go into his office. I'm looking around his office. I see all these books, and on the shelf is a set, like many issues of the Journal of Parapsychology. That made me laugh when he came in, and he said, "What's so funny?" And I told him. He said, "Yeah, I guess you're in the right place." And he and several of the other professors were very interested in psychic phenomena as it appears within the anthropological context. And that became what I studied actually quite a bit at Northwestern until I met Rao, who then told me about JFK and ended up going to John F. Kennedy University at that point.
So it all started with the letter from J.B. Rhine.
It all was because of that letter from J.B. Rhine. Yeah.
That's what enabled you to study it in high school and learn more about it, which then led you to be introduced to other people within the field.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Lloyd, one of the things that I find within this field is that people who are researchers, people who study within this field, are very open to speaking to people who are interested, new people who are interested in this, students, young people. They're very interested in sharing their ideas, helping to encourage them to learn more about these topics.
Yeah, I have found that has always been the case. I mean, everyone I spoke to was so open and approachable. This is even when I was in high school. it just was, it really is an amazing field in that respect, because I think everybody in the field feels that we have a responsibility to carry the field forward. And we want to encourage real interest in our field, not just in the paranormal fluff that's out there in general. That's really important for all of us, I think. I've spoken to, elementary school groups over the years as well, to classes from time to time. So even at a day camp, when I was a counselor, nature and science counselor, I did ESP tests as part of that, which got the parents really interested in it as well. So there are ways that we can kind of reach out in different ways to really fight the bias that's there.
Mhm. Yes, definitely. Well, that's interesting. Interesting how it kind of led you down this path, and you just kept meeting one person after another who seemed to
Yeah,
help
yeah.
you
I
along
mean,
the
yeah,
way.
I was even fortunate with the ASPR. I wasn't applying for a job when I went in. I was visiting the ASPR in New York because I lived outside of New York at that time, in Westchester, and I went in just to use the library. And I had some ideas because my family's in television. I had some ideas of how the ASPR could reach out to TV people. And I started telling somebody at the education department, and she said, "Oh, wait, our new executive director is actually here this week. You should go up and talk to him and give him this information." So I was sent up to this the guy's office, Jack McAllister, and started telling him my ideas. And he looks at me, he says, "Do you want a job?" It's like, okay, sure.
Well, it's as you said, it seems like someone was guiding you through this
Yeah,
process.
yeah.
My experience was similar in a way, but very different. Because when I was younger, I grew up in a family that was very the type of phenomena we study was very normal for us. I was studying meditation, hypnosis, visualization techniques. I learned these things when I was, no exaggeration, 4 or 5 years old. We used to sit with my mother leading us in visualization techniques whenever I was just a small kid with all my brothers and sisters. Um, Healing was something that was very commonly done. My mother treated people as a healer. Her mother did, and her mother, it was kind of a family tradition. And so these phenomena were very normal to me. We knew whenever we played games together that we shouldn't read the answer before we ask the person the question, because they know they'll be able to get the answer from us. When we played with other people, we won all the time. But this happened so often that it was that we accepted it as normal. I can remember for Christmas one year that we got an a game that was, I don't know who produced it, but it was a game that was an ESP test game. It
That's
had
that was Kreskin.
it had ESP cards in it.
That was
It had
Kreskin.
dice in it.
Yeah.
It had score pads. It had all type of instructions on how to do ESP tests. So we had this in our house whenever I was a child. I wish I had one now because I think it's so cool that there was a game like this. But so I use these visualization techniques and these things that we had learned, and hypnosis quite a bit whenever I was growing up. And I can remember one time when I was going to a baseball game, I was doing my visualizations for the baseball game, what was going to happen, what I was going to, how I was going to play and things like this. And somebody asked me, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I told them, "Oh, I'm doing my visualization." And that's when I realized not everybody does this. I thought that everybody did this. I thought this was a normal thing. And and then when I started to explain it to them, I realized very quickly that they had no clue what I was talking about. Not only did they not understand it, but it kind of freaked them out. They were getting very nervous. And then they'd start asking, "Can you read my mind?" And they'd start asking me, and I was like, "No, it doesn't, not quite like that." Well, sometimes, but no, but it was really not something that I could discuss real easily with my friends. And I lost friends as a result of this.
Hmm.
In fact, I asked my mom and my family about it, and we were told, "Don't talk about it. Don't talk about this with other people. Talk about it within our family, but don't talk about it with other people because it'll scare them." But I knew this stuff was real. I knew it was happening. I'd lived with it. Well, I was wondering, how can I help other people understand this? And my father was an engineer. So having spoken to him and having that background, I started to think whether maybe there's a way I can learn through science. By the time I'm a teenager, I'm thinking, is there a way I can use science and the language of science to help people to understand this? I had no idea that there was any studies going on scientifically related to these phenomena. I had no idea that all I knew was different ways to make it easier and make it happen, but I didn't know that there was a way to study it using science. Well, by the time I turned 20, I picked up a book in the used bookshop called Psychic Explorations by Edgar Mitchell. And in the back of that book, it had a list of different places that were institutes that were scientifically studying this work. And one of them was the Rhine Research Center. And I thought, I want to work there someday. Well, this was when I was 20 and I was at school studying philosophy, studying psychology. I studied a little physics along the way, but it didn't really, there was no place for me to study parapsychology. There were no opportunities. There was no one I could really speak to about it that could understand what I was interested in doing. This was the early 80s through the mid 80s. I learned about the Rhine Research Center. I learned about JFK University. But by the time I had graduated from school, JFK had closed their program and it was no longer available. Yeah. So I was in a situation where I didn't have anywhere to study. So I started studying it on my own and just reading whatever I could find. I didn't know about the Journal of Parapsychology. I had no training in research methods at that point, but I knew this is what I was interested in. I would consume anything I could find related to these topics, related to science, related to parapsychology, related to anything related to research or developing your own experiences. It took a number of years. Life happened. I did a lot of different things, including learning a lot about management in different business situations, learning technology and being in the technology world for 20 years. And then at a certain point, I said, if I'm ever going to do this, I need to do it now. I moved to Durham in the 1980s because the Rhine Research Center was here. I went by the Rhine Research Center, which was on Buchanan Boulevard, went by it a number of times, and I'd always say, that's where it is, that's where it is. I even went up on the porch, put my hand on the doorknob, and I could not bring myself to go into the building. For 20 years when I lived in Durham. It was 20 years. And eventually, I went back to school and I studied research. I studied analysis techniques. I learned the language of science. And through the entire process, I was reading parapsychology articles that were published in the Journal of Parapsychology and the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research. And I was utilizing them in my studies. As I was finishing my degree, I saw some activities that were going on at the Rhine and thought, I'm going to go there and talk to them and see if I can learn more about what's going on there. I saw Daryl Bem speak. And when Daryl Bem spoke, he was a parapsychologist, and I was just enamored with the idea of actually meeting a parapsychologist. And we had a nice conversation. I learned more about the work that he was doing. And I was at that point introduced to John Palmer and Sally Reinfeather. And they found out that I had an interest and invited me to join a research meeting. And in 2009, I joined a research meeting at the Rhine, and I never left. 2 years later, I just took over the role of director of the Rhine because they were looking for someone to help out with some things like management of a business. They were looking for someone to help out with technology. These are all the skills I had developed in the 20 years before I stepped through the door of the Rhine Research Center. And when I did, they had an opportunity, they had a need, I had an interest, and between the two of us, we were able to form a partnership that still exists today. So that's kind of how I got here. So let's talk a little bit about the Rhine today? Because Loyd is the president of our board of directors.
Only because you forced me to do it.
And you have just jumped into the role with both
Yeah,
feet,
well,
and I know you just enjoy it a great deal. So the Rhine today, these are just a couple of photos of some of the different things. You know, we have a library, the Alex Tannis Library at the Rhine, that has a great number of volumes, physical volumes of different books related to parapsychology. We continue to expand because today it seems that a lot of libraries are releasing their volumes, their physical volumes of books, and we are collecting them. We are also digitizing a great deal of them and starting to put more and more information online. We're starting out with the journals that we have, specifically the Journal of Parapsychology, and also moving on to some of the other journals we have from the other fields. It's a great resource for anybody who's interested in the field, but you pretty much have to come to see us if you want to use it, unless you're looking for some of our online resources, which you can get to through our website. We also have a number of events. This one over here on the right is similar to an event we have called Psi Games, which we do a couple of times a year at the Rhine live, but it's a way that we can help people to learn about how we used to test ESP, and it's an interactive type of experience. Not only do we do ESP card testing, we have some PK testing as well. People do remote viewing, and we do spoon bending, where we bring people together and help them. We have a spoon bending party. So these are just some of the different activities we do, not to mention all of the online meetings that we have, the online events that we have, and you can learn all about it at the website. But there are some specific areas that we focus on at the Rhine. There are 3 pillars that we talk about. One of them being research, another being education, and then finally, it's building the community. So let me just talk really briefly about the research, because you can see a lot of this in some of our other presentations we've done in the past. We're doing research. You can see at the top there, that's our Healing Energies team, minus 2 people who weren't on the team at that time. But this is our Healing Energies team has been meeting for, I'm going to get it wrong, about 12 years. Every week we've been meeting, which is amazing for any group to meet for that long every week. But we meet and we discuss, and we learned a certain healing technique together, and we're doing research to understand more about what the experience of healing is like, and to try to learn more about what the experience is like for the healers and for the participants in healing. We aren't specifically targeting whether the healing works or not. That's something different. But one of the things we are looking at is how this might occur. And we're doing that by looking to see if we can determine what is the energy that people talk about when they talk about energy healing. We have a lab, it's called the Bioenergy Lab at the Rhine, where we measure ultraviolet light, which are photons, light that occurs in the ultraviolet range. They call them biophotons, and we bring people in to see if we can detect the light, which is a form of energy, coming from people when they're doing their healing practice, when they're doing
John
martial arts.
should mention that biophotons are not a psychic phenomena per se. They're well established in a variety of fields, in biophysics and biology. So this is not us saying, "Oh, let's make something up." This is a real thing in mainstream science.
Yes, well, of course, light is a real thing, and
even our
it's
brains can-
measurable. It's
Yeah.
measurable, which is very cool. But the idea of biophotons, or what they're calling ultra-weak photon emissions now, is that this is light that comes from organic matter. It used to be crazy talk back in the 1970s. Nobody really cared about it, but now it's studied in biology, upper level biology courses, and they're trying to understand where does the light originate? Where does it come from? And why is it there? What is it used for? All organic matter produces biophotons. People, plants, all animals, even individual cells. We see it within the brain. we see this light occurring. And the question is, what is it being used for? We're looking at it specifically related to people who are having psi type experiences to try to see if it's related to the phenomena that they're studying. And we're getting some very interesting results. In addition, we look at, you can see in the center there, that's actually the Ganzfeld, which we were talking about earlier, that Charles Honorton had developed a number of years ago. We are looking at it back in the, I guess he developed it and it became really popular back in the 1980s. And it really hasn't changed a whole lot in that time. We're trying to see if there's ways that we might be able to modify it that might make it still effective, but easier to use and a better experience for the people involved. And so we're exploring the Ganzfeld. And in addition, over there on the right, you can see that's something we use to measure mind-matter interaction. It's a wheel, a very well-balanced wheel that sits on top of a pin. And we're trying to see if people are able to spin this wheel when it's in a sealed container. And we have some people who do it quite well and quite regularly. So these are just some of the research projects we're working on. As Angela mentioned at the beginning, we're also working with other organizations, including some research related to a phenomenon called aphantasia, but I don't have time to get into that today. But I do want to move on because this is another area that has really become very big within the center, and that is the Rhine Education Center. Loyd and I have been working together on this since about 2011, I think. Well, late 2011, I think he joined us.
Yeah,
in 2012.
like that, yeah.
And we've been developing the school from being a single course, which was Introduction to Parapsychology, to incorporating a great deal related to field investigations and extending it to help people to learn more about parapsychology. All these people, these are different instructors. They're not all of them, but these are a number of different instructors who are part of the school and who either have taught or will be teaching in the coming year. Loyd, what do you want to say about the school for us here?
Well, first of all, I think that our expansion has been slow, but really good. I do have to say that COVID, the pandemic, kickstarted the whole idea of online education to a completely new level because people pretty much couldn't communicate other than on Zoom. I mean, Zoom was barely being used by people prior to that. So we have a good student body that comes in for this. It's people from all over the world. I'm really always excited to see people from other countries who are taking our courses. We have developed certificate programs because we're trying to produce parapsychologists in some respects. It may not be an actual accredited degree program, but the education I think they're getting is an incredibly good foundation for anything they want to do in the field. I mean, you teach research methods classes too, but we're teaching also classes about experiencing the phenomena, experiencing things too. So it really is a well-rounded set of courses, which we're continuing to expand as we get more people to teach, and eventually as you get some help running the classes.
Yes, and right now we have three different schools. About 4 years ago, we broke the school into three different areas. One of them being consciousness studies, which includes parapsychology and all the studies related to research methods, analysis, and learning about the different phenomena. How do you study ESP? How do you study PK? How do you study healing? What is energy? All of these topics are covered underneath the School of Consciousness Studies. We also have the School of Applied Sciences, where you might take the information that we learn in parapsychology and find a way to apply it. That incorporates things like field investigations, which is Loyd's expertise. Loyd has a lot of expertise in different areas, but field investigations is one area where he teaches a number of courses related to this. We have 2 certificate programs related to that. Applied Sciences also includes remote viewing. It includes out-of-body experiences. It includes lucid dreaming. All of these things being part of how you might apply the information we learned in the field of parapsychology. In addition, we have a third school. I guess it was a few years ago that I started talking to Chantal Toporov, who is in the bottom right there, and we started to discuss how psi starts to appear in different parts of our lives that are more related to the liberal arts, within art, within music, within nature, within just our normal experiences. Sally Drucker teaches a course on writing about your experiences. All of these came together under the School of Liberal Arts and Creative Sciences. And so we have certificate programs in each of these different schools to help people to follow the path that they're most interested in. If you're not interested in the laboratory work and the sciences, maybe you're interested in writing about your experiences or learning about how to use it within your arts. Or if you're interested in developing your own field investigations team, you can take the courses that Loyd teaches, and we can learn more about that together. So this is a little bit about the Rhine Education Center.
Yeah, I just want to mention one more thing. I feel it's really great that we have a number of students who are interested in the material, interested in the subject matter. They don't care about getting a certificate. In fact, they don't want to care about getting a grade for that, but they're really taking advantage of what we're offering so that they can enrich their lives. And I think that kind of enrichment is important to all of us as adults.
Yeah, and some people are actually taking what we're teaching them and going to other universities.
Yeah.
And taking courses and becoming professional parapsychologists. Others have gone on and used it in their lives in different ways, in their professional lives in different ways. So there's a lot of opportunity. Or if you're just curious, there's a lot of people who just take a few courses because they're curious about things.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the education aspect of what we do. What's coming up? So this year is 90 years with the Rhine. It started at Duke Parapsychology Lab in 1935. We're still following the same mission. We're trying to understand and advance the field of parapsychology by looking at these phenomena that we all know, these exceptional experiences that we have, looking at the experiences that people describe, the paranormal experiences that people describe, and trying to understand more about them. There have been so many people that have come through the Rhine over the years. We mentioned a few of them tonight, and some of them are going to come back and speak to us about their experiences and their connections to the Rhine. So once a month, we are planning to have a speaker who's going to talk about who were either associated with the Rhine or talk about how the Rhine has influenced their lives. One of them being Christine Simmons Moore, who, as I mentioned earlier, she co-founded the Rhine Education Center with us, and she also is a researcher in the field. Another is Mitch Horowitz, who's down here on the bottom left. Mitch is a writer. He's written extensively about different topics related to the paranormal and parapsychology. And Mitch is going to talk to us about how J.B. Rhine's work and how the work at the Rhine Research Center has influenced his life and his writings. We also have Stephen Schwartz, who I mentioned was the executive director, and Joe McMonigal, who's in the bottom right-hand corner here, who is probably, and I say this and he hates when I say it, one of the most psychic people I've ever met. Joe has been practicing remote viewing for quite a number of years, but he's had many different experiences. He is on our board of directors and is a great friend of the Rhine. We have so much happening in the future. If you want to keep up with us, here's just a way that you can get up with us on the website. You can follow us on these different social media platforms. We're on Facebook, YouTube, Blue Sky, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it now. I don't know what they're calling it. Or if you have an experience and you'd like to report it, you're welcome to write to experience@rhine.org. All right. Hey, Loyd, why don't we come together here for a minute? Let me stop the share. And if anyone has any questions or anything, you're welcome to join us and to write them in the chat and let us know what your questions might be. We're happy to talk about whatever you might be interested in. Loyd, did we miss anything here that you wanted to talk about?
Oh, I think we went long enough. So any
So I have a question, guys. So there seems to be this growing fascination with parapsychology and paranormal phenomena that's bringing more attention, public attention to the field. So how can we encourage people to be more open-minded but discerning with, how would they evaluate the quality of studies and research claims?
Go ahead, Loyd.
Well, I was going to say first, a lot of that attention is coming because of the paranormal TV shows, which have really no relationship, and is to reality. I have to say that reality TV is not real. So part of my personal mission has been to try to separate out what TV is doing and how they're presenting things versus what actually goes on in the field and how much more exciting things can be than standing around in the dark getting an AVP if doing something like that. So we really need to do more outreach. We need more folks to come to us, and we're getting people certainly from that paranormal community world who are coming in, but we need to train them also to go out and be advocates for our field, for the actual field, not just for the gizmos and things that they're using on TV that so many ghost hunting groups are doing. It's one of the reasons I teach a course called Presenting the Paranormal to the Public, is actually how to talk about this credibly and how to separate that exact thing that you're talking about, kind of really look at things credibly.
And a large part of it is to know what are reliable sources.
Yeah.
This is a very important thing. So many people there. I mean, there are science journalists out there who write about science, and they are at different levels of knowledge. A lot of times, they're trying to get views. They're looking to produce headlines that are going to get them more attention. And Ange, I think your mic might be feedback with us. Yes, I think
That's
that's what
better.
it was.
Yeah.
So a lot of them are looking to get attention, and so they will make claims beyond what the researchers are claiming. They'll make claims beyond what the scientists are writing in their papers. And so it's important to go back and check the resources and look through the references. If you believe something sounds too good to be true or phenomenal, check it out a bit more. It is a challenge because different people in the field have different levels of rigor in their research. One of the things about the Rhine, we've always tried to produce any information we produce. We try to produce it with a great deal of scientific integrity. We try to make sure that anything we say, we're interpreting conservatively. We're not overly interpreting what we're finding. But some people in the field are not quite as rigorous, and they do it in other ways. Where I would recommend to find the best information is to go to the Parapsychological Association. Find the members of the Parapsychological Association. And as I mentioned earlier, people within the field, we're very responsive to questions. I would definitely recommend, if you're interested, write a note to someone who you might have a question. Hey, what's going on? I'm trying to understand this better. Is this really definitive evidence that out-of-body experiences are happening? Or is this really definitive evidence that it's not happening? And find out what the Parapsychological Association has to say about it. You join these different organizations, you start getting invitations to different events. The Rhine, we can always take some of our courses as well. We teach these things. We teach people how to make good choices when they have sources they're interested in. Someone's asking about AI, Loyd. Does AI play a role in parapsychological research? Do you see it playing a role?
I do see it. I mean, I'm somewhat immersed in AI because of the company I work for. And in fact, I have, because the company I work for has the Journal of Parapsychology online as well. I've just downloaded about 300 papers from the last few years, and I'm going to run it through a large language model asking questions about that pool of material because I can. I have access to something that lets me upload that much. and see what kinds of questions I can ask it. I see AI in that way because it's already being used. There are kind of large language models being specifically tailored for medical research, for example, to ingest large numbers of papers that are there. And I see that as a boon to science in general, because we don't have somebody like Louisa Rhine who's sitting there doing that. We have Sonali Marwaha, who's done that with the Stargate stuff, but those are the exceptions to the rule. So once things are digitized and digestible by these large language models, we'll be able to ask to look for patterns. And I know already I'm reading about some fields some folks who have done that and asking to design an experimental model, design a product that does better than the one that's out there based on all the stuff you've ingested. And it's working. So the problem, of course, funding. That's always the fun, because using these models can cost a lot of money if you're not already working for some place that has access to the models. But there are, not so expensive models ways we can do it. And now with agentic AI, which, sets things off on their own, we'll be able to actually create kind of mini versions ourselves to look at our research.
Right. Yeah, it's a great opportunity to go through all of the data that's been produced and be able to explore it in ways that we would like to, but we don't have the time and the energy to do it. We can use the tools to go through that task for us, and that's a great way to move forward with it. Other questions? Does AI have psi? Would it be able to do precognition? These are all questions that, we really don't know any answers to these at this time.
Well, what I'd like to see? I'd like to see the weather data, meteorological data put in so that at least they can predict the weather in an accurate way. Considering, I always have to point to when they say psychics can't predict the future accurately. It's like, neither can the weather guys.
Right.
And that's a physical science. Come on.
Well, Loyd, I think we've kind of worn things out. And Angela, unless you have anything else there.
No, just be on the lookout for the emails to get notified when our events are coming up. We've got a good lineup of speakers coming up.